So, the review of the day is for Ursula LeGuin's The Lathe of Heaven. And so many thoughts and feelings about this book. Let's start with the book itself. The beautiful cover, which is intuitively unconnected to the story. I think I was about 2/3 through the book before I finally realized what this teetering mess and the volcano in the back are meant to represent. I guess that's just a bit slow of me. The edition is a Panther science fiction. It is in appalling condition. I don't know if that's the way it was when I bought it. It was part of my recent enormous book haul from Brisbane, 176 books, mostly classic sci-fi and fantasy. I think it actually was not in great condition to begin with, and the spine and the pages are not wholly connected. So even though I've now finished it, I'm very unlikely to pass this on simply because of the poor condition of the book. But Panther science fiction, amazing illustration. I can't really go past that. Maybe a word or two about Ursula Le Guin herself. Ursula Le Guin is a major voice in science fiction. She's iconic, she's incredibly well known, she's been amazingly influential. Reading about her career sometimes makes me think that the influential in science fiction, as often as not, it seems to have more to do, maybe not more to do, as much to do with their lifestyle as with their writing. Le Guin writes beautifully and has got amazing concepts, but she was also a strong part of the science fiction culture. She was an editor for some editions, she contributed to others. She was part of the lifestyle. And whereas you may have other science fiction authors who did great things, I'm going to point at randomly maybe Joyce Belu-Gregorian. Less well known overall, and I think it has to do with the part they played in sci-fi culture. Now, a couple of Le Guin's earliest works were, I think, definitely the Earthsea fantasy series. I think was her first really well known, really well received, or no, A Wizard of Earthsea specifically. That was in 1968. And then you had The Left Hand of Darkness came out straight after. Now, The Left Hand of Darkness received both Hugo and Nebula awards, and I think that probably made her the first woman to receive both awards. And I guess that cemented her career. I actually would have liked to read The Left Hand of Darkness. I've just finished a David Brin novel called Glory Season, and there were a lot of parallels in what Brin was doing with Glory Season and what I seem to remember Le Guin doing in The Left Hand of Darkness. So I really wanted to read that. Turns out I don't have a copy anymore. I know I did have a copy. It was probably in worse condition than this one, and I don't have it anymore. But The Lathe of Heaven was right there, so I went on to Le Guin in that method. And let's see, what else should one really say about Le Guin? Oh yes, if you watch other people's watch or read other people's reviews, or if you read articles about Le Guin, I've noticed every single one claims that a specific book is her most famous or her most widely recognized or the one everyone knows about, except that every book that's ever mentioned is that. A Wizard of Earthsea, the Earthsea trilogy, The Left Hand of Darkness, The Lathe of Heaven. You're going to find someone who's claiming that it's her most famous work. I think probably The Left Hand of Darkness, in terms of awards, deserves that more, but I think probably more people have heard of and read the Earthsea trilogy than that. Anyway, I just find that slightly amusing, and I'm probably wrong. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong. I'm good with it. Now, this is a reread, of course. I do know that I read The Lathe of Heaven a very long time ago. I was a teenager. I seem to remember being less than impressed with it as a teen. I might have been a bit young for it. I might not have quite jived with all the implications. And once again, as a teen, I needed action. And while there was action in there, I didn't dislike this book. I did enjoy it. I wasn't blown away by it. So I probably just didn't appreciate the beauty of the writing. And without enjoying the writing in this book, which is stupendously beautiful, really, it probably wouldn't be your favorite book. Yes, the beauty of the writing. Let me turn to page 38, which I have prepared earlier with my bookmark. I'm going to read a paragraph from right at the bottom of the page. Orr was not a fast reasoner. In fact, he was not a reasoner. He arrived at ideas the slow way, never skating over the clear, hard ice of logic, nor soaring on the slipstreams of imagination, but slogging, plodding along on the heavy ground of existence. He did not see connections, which is said to be the hallmark of intellect. He felt connections, like a plumber. He was not really a stupid man, but he did not use his brains half as much as he might have done, or half as fast. I think that this is a beautiful example of the understated loveliness of writing. There's passages further on, for example, that are far more descriptive, but I think in terms of the resonance and the way the language rolls off the page into your head, I think that's a lovely example. And I thoroughly enjoyed the writing, as well as the actual plot, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's kind of ironic, I guess, that while I wanted the Right Hand of Darkness because of Glory Season, the Lathe of Heaven actually ended up being far more similar to the actual book that I'm listening to as an audio book, which is Recursion by Blake Crouch. Both of them have as a central theme memory and the importance it plays. So I've got to say, I'm sorry, Blake Crouch. Ursula LeGuin's book is miles and miles and several kilometers and maybe a few light years ahead of Recursion, which I'm struggling with. But I'll get to Recursion in another review. Okay, I don't know if anyone actually thinks you can spoiler the plot to a book that was published in 71, copyright in 71. If you do, probably go away. I'm going to talk about the plot and I'm going to talk about the characters. And if you think that a spoiler is a thing that's going to bother you, don't stay for it, I guess. So the Lathe of Heaven starts out with the character who was mentioned in that small snippet I read earlier, George Orr, and it starts with him. It starts with a quite understatedly exciting scene. He's in the corridor of his apartment building, and the guy who takes care of the apartment building, or manager? It doesn't seem like a manager, he seems more like a bellhop. Anyway, finds him in the corridor. He can't really speak. He's struggling to make sense, struggling to walk. He gets him back to his apartment and he collapses and he says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Orr, I'm going to have to call a doctor for you." He calls the doctor. The doctor discovers that he has been taking combinations of medications that aren't recommended. Now, in this future world of Ursula Le Guin's imagination, everyone has a little card, which I'm going to assume is kind of like the Australian Medicare card, only this card allows you to get a certain number of medications over a certain amount of time. So if you want more medications or different types of medications, you have to use someone else's tab. George Orr has accumulated a whole heap of 2 types of medications, barbiturates, and I can't remember what the other one is, and he's been taking them unsensibly. The doctor says that since he's on call, he's got to refer him on for treatment. This puts George Orr in voluntary psychiatric treatment. I can't remember the actual catchphrase for having taken these medications. VTT. Voluntary something or other. Voluntary, there we go. Voluntary therapeutic treatment, which apparently is state supplied, which is very un-American. I've just got to say, it's far more Australian. But this is the future world which Ursula LeGuin has created. So George Orr fronts up to Dr. Haber, and the description of George Orr is quite magnificent. He's almost a non-entity. He's so medium and mild, non-committal, not harsh, not really anything. But as the book goes on, you see more and more of him, and he becomes stronger without ever changing, and more interesting as you see him through the eyes of others, especially a lady called Heather, who has a surname in French that I'm not even going to try and pronounce. LeGuin spoke French. I don't. But as you see George through this woman's eyes, she's shocked to find him to be one of the strongest people she's encountered. And that's all these different facets build up George Orr from the outside rather than the inside. It's told in third person, second person, third person. Anyway, not from Orr's point of view, but not through his point of view, as it were. Now, Dr. Haber, in examining Orr, is also perfectly described, and we can see in him the quintessential arrogant, sure they know everything doctor or psychologist or psychiatrist. Before George Orr even tells him things, he thinks he already knows them. But then Orr surprises him. Orr not only believes, but is certain that he can dream normally. He's been avoiding sleep. He was using the medication so as not to sleep because he's afraid of a particular type of dream he has. He has normal sleep sometimes and normal dreams, but occasionally he has this particular kind of sleep which becomes known as E-sleep later on, and he calls it something beginning with E. Here I am drifting back into the book again. Anyway, he has this particular kind of sleep in which whatever he dreams then becomes real in the real world. Not only does it become real in the real world, it becomes that it has always been real in the real world. Dr. Haber is what he calls himself a neurologist. He specializes in dreams and sleep therapies, and he's built this machine to analyze the brain waves of people who are asleep so that he can feed it back to the patient, though I'm tempted to say victim here, and replicate those sleep patterns in their own head for therapeutic purposes, of course. He's an experimental psychologist rather than a heavily influential one. He's got this old office that he works out where everything is fake wood, fake metal, fake everything. There's no windows. There's a huge picture of Mount Hood on the wall and not much else, except this experimental machine that he's been developing and which he then tests on Orr. At the point when he tests it on Orr, he doesn't truly believe what Orr's saying, of course. Orr knows that no one's going to believe what he says, because what he says is unbelievable. When he was 17, he had his aunt, his mother's sister, staying with him. He was desperate for her to leave, and he fell asleep, and he dreamt her not... He was desperate for her not to be there anymore. So he fell asleep, he dreamt her not being anymore, and what that involved was her having died in a car accident some time ago, and so she'd never actually moved in. Now, George himself remembered both timelines, and he remembered enough of the dream to know that it was the dream that had changed it, but No one else remembered his aunt ever having stayed with them. For them, the reality in which she died in a car accident before she ever moved in was the only reality. George himself is the only one who remembers every time he changes things. And as he changes them, he has a deep belief that it's not his right to change, that it's wrong of him to be changing reality in this way, and this is why he's trying desperately not to sleep. So Dr. Haber doesn't exactly believe him, but he hooks him up to this machine. He replicates this elegant sleep? Not elegant sleep. Prophetic sleep? It's not prophetic sleep. Emotional? Yeah. Wish I could remember the word. It was a good word. Well done, Ursula LeGuin. Bad omnivorous Deb for forgetting it. Anyway, he replicates this and he starts implanting hypnotic suggestions into George Orr, that will change reality. George Orr tries to explain, increasingly desperately to Haber, why this is a bad thing, because he's waking up and the world's changed in strange ways. The first attempt is he just changes the picture on his wall from a wall to a horse, and that seems fairly mild. But as he comes to believe it more, he changes bigger and bigger things without ever admitting to poor old George that he believes it and that it's real. So George still has that, am I insane? Will the rest of the world believe that I'm insane feeling? Very unethical thing for a medical professional to do. But Haber becomes less and less ethical as time goes on. All of a sudden, after one reality change, we find that Haber is no longer working out of a small dingy office. He's head of an institute of Waneros studies that never existed in the previous reiteration, and more vividly and violently and unethically he seeks to change the world. Now Haber is sure that he's a right-thinking, moral person. He's sure that he's benevolent and he's changing the world to make it a better place. He's frustrated by his instrument, George Orr, who doesn't want to change the world. And he's frustrated that his suggestions never seem to work out the way he thinks they should. So it's the old deal with the devil thing. Haber will say, change the world so that no one on earth is fighting with their fellow men. And poor old George wakes up and no one on earth is fighting with his fellow men because aliens have invaded. Small things like that. At one point in this book, when he's explaining how important these changes are and how they shouldn't be ignored, he talks about, what if Dr. Haber asked me to imagine a pink dog in the room when I woke up? Well, there's two ways it could happen. One would be that someone's poodle was there and they've had a dye job and they've been dyed pink, and that would be fine. But since he has no control over his dreaming brain and no control over how it changes the world, it well might be that the dog would be pink naturally. That would mean that you would have had to change the entire evolution of the canines right back to when they were splitting off from the general carnivorous tree, maybe right back to mammals, maybe we're going back to Jurassic, and changing things so dramatically that a gene for pink fur exists where it never had before. And every time he changes things, he remembers them, and he's increasingly sure that Dr. Haber remembers them. But for everyone else, the world just continues as it ever had. So in this book, LeGuin not only creates a fascinating, more than slightly dystopian future, but she also creates many of them because they change from one page to another and within a chapter, and we're not always sure which bits changed. Despite that level of change should be impossible to manage in a book that's 156 pages long, she does a spectacular job. There's bits where you can't keep the different tracks separate, sure, but it doesn't matter because that helps create the jumble, mixed feeling that the actual inhabitants of this world have. So yes, Ursula Le Guin. She definitely wrote fantasy. Earthsea is fantasy. It's more sword and sorcery than anything else. And it's got a beautifully consistent world building, magic system, humanity to it. But In other books, she's got ones that I think definitely creep into the science fiction. I don't see how the Lathe of Heaven can really be anything but good quality early science fiction. It's certainly speculative fiction because it's heavily speculative in many, many different ways. And it is also dystopian because this world in which George and Dr. Haber start off has suffered some major horrible things. It's heavily overcrowded, it's polluted, there's widespread starvation. Though medications are still free. Figure that one out. But yes, as that world changes, it becomes different, and eventually aliens come into it. Are the aliens a bit of a Deus Ex Machina in resolving the plot and pulling George and the chaos out of being? I don't really think so. I think they're too integral. I think the way they're blended into the plot makes them interesting. And they leave more questions than they answer. And I feel that like your average Deus Ex Machina is just a way of plucking things out and recovering. Whereas in here they are a thing to think about and consider. For the most part of this book, it is, shall we say, worrying. It's disturbing. There's concepts of change and what's right and wrong to do to people on an individual basis, like what Haber's doing to George, or on a widespread basis, what Haber is conspiring to do to the whole of the world, and it all comes crashing down eventually. There's also a fair amount of science and what we knew about dream states and dream science and neurology. For the 70s, LeGuin used a lot of that in describing the machine and what was happening in the different dream states, REM and so forth. I didn't think it was badly done. Some of it, of course, is out of date, maybe even a lot out of date. But that element was definitely pretty sciencey. The aliens at the end make it even more science fiction, and the chaos ending is probably the most worrying and the most disturbing of all. It's got, if not a happy ending, then a consistent ending. It takes us into a place to think about human connections and whether they really are on the deep personal level, or whether they are what we make them, or whether they are what we think they are. Anyway, brilliant book, The Lathe of Heaven. Very glad I got it in the recent huge book haul. Very happy to reread it. It's getting a 5 from me on Goodreads because it may not be Ursula Le Guin's best book, but it's the best one of hers that I've read for a long time. And I am now keen to go on and read more, because this one, the lyrical writing made this a terrifically moving book in places. And the characterization, though we don't have a lot of characters, we've got George Orr, we've got Dr. Haber, and we've got Heather. So between the writing and the characterization, the amazing world building, and the amazing what if, it's the speculative what if of science fiction and speculative fiction and fiction that always drew me in. And this is almost an ideal of a book to make you wonder about the what ifs. What if you wake up one day and you realize that your dreaming can change the world, but you have no control over that dream? What could you do with it? What would it do to you?